On the last Saturday of April 1869, the pay table went up under a lodgepole pine at the camp the men called Blue Canyon, and Lan took her place at the end of the line, the way she had every Saturday for a year. She was the camp's laundress and mender, the one whose hands knew every man's shirt by its particular tier, and she was paid, as she was always paid, not in the silver dollars that slid across the table to the white crews, but in a fistful of brass tokens the men called buttons, good for nothing outside the company store and its company prices. Everyone at that pay table expected her to close her hand around the buttons and bow, the way she always had, the way the whole camp had come to expect without ever once deciding it. What one quiet miner did with a set of assay scales instead, and what she had been writing by candlelight all that year, in a book sewn from cloth no one else had read, broke the company store before the summer was out. Blue Canyon in the spring of 1869 was two camps wearing one name, the grade above, where black powder opened the granite in long gray coughs, and the row of canvas below, where the company kept its ledgers. The white crews were paid on Saturday in coin they could spend anywhere from Sacramento to San Francisco. The Chinese crews, the ones who had cut the grade through granite no one else would touch, were paid in scrip good only at the counter 30 feet from the pay table, where the company set its own prices on flour, oil, and thread. Lan had come to understand the arithmetic of it early, a token worth $1 at the store's counter and worth nothing at all anywhere else. She had never once, in a year of Saturdays, been handed a coin. What the camp did not know was that Lan kept a ledger of her own, a strip of muslin sewn into a book no larger than her two hands, filled at night with columns of characters and numbers by a stub of candle. Her father had counted silk and tea for a guild hall in Canton, and he had taught her the abacus before he taught her to sew. In the cloth book she wrote what each token was truly worth in coin, what the company owed her by that true worth, and, because the men of her own shift had begun asking, quietly, at the edge of the wash line, what the company owed them too. By spring she was keeping the numbers for half the camp, in a hand no foreman had ever asked to see. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a miner named Thomas Reese brought her a torn coat and paid the mending in a pinch of raw gold shaken straight from his poke into her palm, not scrip, not the company's brass, but gold, weighed by no one but his own rough thumb, handed over in front of the storekeeper as if the difference were the most natural thing in the world. He said only 2 words. He kept doing it. By August, the whole camp would watch him carry her tin of tokens to the assayer's scale in front of everyone who worked the grade, and weigh out, coin by coin, exactly what a year of buttons had cost her. But that Tuesday, nobody knew what was coming. Nobody but the two of them, and neither of them said so. Dawn came to Blue Canyon the color of ash, and Lan was already at the lines, working lye soap into a shirt so stiff with rock dust it could nearly stand on its own. She had strung her ropes between 2 supply tents where the wind came down off the grade clean, and she had learned, in a year, to read the whole camp by what its clothes told her, which men had been in the tunnel, which had slept in the open, which had torn a sleeve on granite and which on temper. Steam rose off the washpots into air still cold enough to bite. Above the tents, the grade climbed in a gray scar toward the notch the crews were cutting through solid rock, and twice that morning she heard the flat cough of black powder rolling down the canyon, felt it more than heard it, a pressure against her sternum before the sound arrived. Her father, before any of this, had kept the tea accounts for a guild hall in Canton and had taught her figures before he taught her anything else. She thought of him now the way she thought of most things before noon, briefly and without letting it slow her hands. Saturday was 2 days off. She already knew, without needing to check, exactly what it would bring her. The camp had grown up around the grade the way camps did, canvas first, then plank, then the one building in Blue Canyon with a proper door, which was the company store. Behind its counter sat flour, oil, tobacco, thread, tinned peaches, and a coil of good rope, all of it priced by a man named Purdy, who answered to the railroad and to no one else within 40 miles. The white crews, graders, and track layers, who lived in the bunk cars up the line, were paid Saturdays in coin, good in any town from here to Sacramento. The Chinese crews, the men who had opened the granite nobody else would touch, who lived in the canvas rows below the grade, and Lan among them, though she worked for wages, not for the railroad directly, were paid in brass tokens the size of $1, stamped with the company's initials, redeemable at exactly one counter in the world. A token bought what the counter said it bought, at the price the counter set that day, for that customer. Lan had done the sum more than once, quietly, on the back of a laundry ticket. A season's wages, spent nowhere but here, left a man with less than he had started, no matter how hard the granite had fought him. On Saturdays, the company set a plank table under the one lodgepole pine that had survived the clearing, and a paymaster named Dolan sat behind it with 2 ledgers and 2 tin boxes. Into the first box went silver dollars, and these he slid, without much ceremony, to the graders and track crews who filed past in their turn, calling out surnames he mostly bothered to get right. Into the second box went brass tokens, counted out by weight rather than by care, and these went to the Chinese crews, Lan's shift among them, in a line that moved faster because there was less to say. When her turn came, Dolan did not look up. He had a rhythm: dip, count, pour, and her hand appeared at the edge of the table the way 40 other hands had, and he filled it with tokens the way he had filled the others, and he was already reaching for the next name before she had closed her fingers around the brass. It was not cruelty, exactly. It was simpler than cruelty. It did not require him to see her at all, and by the 4th Saturday of this, she had stopped expecting him to. At the store, prices moved the way weather did, without explanation and without appeal. Lan watched Purdy quote a sack of flour to a white grader for 1 figure, then quote the same sack, not 10 minutes later, to a Chinese track hand for a figure half again as much, in the same flat voice, as though the 2 numbers were simply 2 different facts about 2 different kinds of flour. Nobody wrote either price down. When she stepped up herself with her fistful of tokens, Purdy's eyes went first to the brass in her palm, and only after that, briefly, to her face, and he named a sum for oil and thread that she was almost certain, because there was no ledger to check it against but her own head, ran higher than what he had charged the man ahead of her for the same goods. She paid it. There was nowhere else to buy oil in 40 miles, and a token spent nowhere was a token wasted entirely. She carried her parcel back to the wash line, turning the arithmetic over the way she turned over a stubborn stain, looking for the thread that, pulled correctly, would make the whole pattern loosen. That night she laid the week's tokens out on her cot in a single line and looked at them the way her father used to look at a column that would not balance, not with anger, but with the patient attention of a man who believed every column could be made to balance eventually, if you were willing to sit with it long enough. A token was worth, at the counter, whatever Purdy said it was worth that day, but a token was also, underneath that, a promise from the company, $1 of wages, converted into brass instead of coin, and $1 was a fixed thing whether or not anyone in this canyon chose to treat it that way. She had begun, without quite deciding to, keeping the true figure, the coin figure, beside the token figure, so that she would always know the distance between what she was owed and what she had been given to stand in for it. The distance, week, was small. It had not always been small. She did not yet know what she would do with the sum of all those small distances, only that she intended to keep counting them until she did. The cloth book lived under a loose board beneath her cot, wrapped in oilskin against the damp. She had sewn it herself the 2nd week in camp, a strip of muslin folded and stitched along one edge into pages, because paper here was scarce and asked for by name if it went missing, and cloth asked for by no one. Each night, by a stub of candle she rationed as carefully as flour, she opened it on her knee and wrote in careful columns, tokens received, coin value, goods bought, goods owed. She worked the thimble on her forefinger as she wrote, out of old habit rather than need, her father's thimble, brass gone smooth as river stone, the one object she had carried whole across an ocean when everything else had to be sold, mended, or left. He had given it to her the year he taught her the abacus, saying a woman who could count and a woman who could sew would never go hungry in the same year. She had not entirely believed him at 12. She was beginning, now, at 20, to suspect he had been telling her something larger than he said. It began with Aquak, from the drilling crew, who came to her one evening with his week's tokens knotted in a handkerchief and asked, in the careful English he was still building word by word, whether she might check the count against what the company said it had paid him. She checked it. The company was short by 4 tokens, a fact Ah Kwok took to Dolan the next morning with her figures written on a scrap and, after some argument, 4 tokens back in his pocket. After that, the handkerchiefs came more often, a driller here, a powderman there, men from her own shift and men from crews she barely knew by face, each one trusting her with a private column of what he was owed, what he had spent, what he was saving toward a passage home or a debt owed a cousin in San Francisco. She began keeping their figures in the same cloth book as her own, in a second set of columns, careful to mark whose was whose. By spring's end she was carrying, without any title for it, something closer to half the camp's accounts than her own alone. Her father had kept the books for a tea and silk guild in Canton, a narrow room of dark wood and abacus click, and he had let her sit at his elbow from the time she was old enough to hold a brush steady. Other men's daughters learned to read poetry. She learned to reconcile a column that would not close, to find the single transposed digit hiding inside 40 pages of correct ones. It was a skill the guild valued in him and would never have thought to value in her, and so he had taught her at night, at the same low table where he taught her to sew, as though the 2 skills were simply 2 hands of the same body. When the guild's fortunes turned and his position went with them, there had been little left in Toishan for a family of 5 and a great deal of talk, up and down the delta, about Gam San, the Gold Mountain, and the wages a strong back could earn there. She had come on a contract of her own choosing, if choosing was the word for the only door that opened. She had not expected the door, once through it, to lead to a laundry line in the Sierra granite. Half of every coin equivalent she reckoned herself owed, land set aside before she let herself think of anything else it might buy. It went, dollar by careful dollar, toward a passage. Not her own, she had already made that crossing and did not intend to unmake it, but her younger sister May's, still in Toishan with their mother, 12 years old the last letter said, growing into a girl who deserved better choices than the guild's collapse had left the rest of them. Lan could not yet write a letter herself in the hand that mattered, so she paid a camp cook who had schooling to set down what she dictated, a few lines each month, careful of every word because words, like tokens, cost something to send. She kept the running sum for May's passage in the cloth book in its own column, apart from her own accounts, and did not let herself total it too often, because the total was always smaller than she wanted, and the wanting did no good. "M'goy," she wrote at the end of every letter, to the cook for the writing and, in her heart, to whatever unnamed thing might get a 12-year-old girl safely across an ocean. It was the only prayer she allowed herself. Thomas Reese worked the granite face with the powdermen, a big, slow-spoken man who ate at the edge of the cook fire rather than in its center, and answered questions with as few words as the question allowed. The camp had theories about him the way camps always had theories about a quiet man, that he'd killed someone, that he'd lost someone, that he was simply built that way and it meant nothing at all, and none of the theories seemed to trouble him enough to correct any of them. Lan had noticed him the way she noticed most men in camp, by his shirts, too, both good wool gone thin at the elbow, mended by no one because he had not, in the months she had been here, brought either one to the wash line. He watched more than he spoke. She had noticed that too, in the particular way he watched the pay table on Saturdays, not at the coins sliding to the white crews, and not at the brass sliding to hers, but at the line of faces receiving each, as though he were doing a private sum of his own that he had not yet finished. He came to her wash line on an ordinary Tuesday with a coat torn clean along the shoulder seam, granite having caught it somewhere in the tunnel, and he held it out without preamble the way a man hands over any piece of broken equipment he wants fixed. "Can you mend this?" he said, not quite a question. She took it, turned the tear to the light, felt the weight of good wool between her fingers, better cloth than most men in camp owned, and told him Thursday, if the thread held. He nodded once, the way he seemed to do most things, and stood a moment longer than the transaction required, looking not at her, but at the lines strung between the tents, the shirts and trousers of 40 other men snapping in the wind, as if counting them. Then he touched his hat brim, said nothing further, and walked back up toward the grade. She watched him go before she caught herself watching and turned back to the wash pot. It was, she would think later, an entirely unremarkable exchange. She had no way yet to know it was the first entry in an account that would take the rest of the year to settle. Thursday, she brought the mended coat to the powder crew's supply tent, where Reese was coiling fuse wire, and he inspected the seam with the same unhurried thoroughness he seemed to give everything, running his thumb along the stitches twice. Then, instead of reaching for scrip or asking her to run a tab, he untied the leather poke at his belt and tipped a pinch of raw gold straight into her open palm. Dust and 2 small nuggets, more than triple the mending's worth by any fair count, weighed by nothing more official than the set of his own thumb against the mouth of the poke. Purdy, sweeping the store's front step 20 feet off, straightened at the color of it. Reese did not glance his way. "For the coat," he said, and then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something, "Ma'am." It was the first time in a year anyone in this camp had paid her in metal instead of a company's promise about metal. She closed her hand around it slowly, feeling the grit of raw gold against her palm, and understood, before she had fully thought it through, that something in the camp's arithmetic had just been quietly, permanently disturbed. That evening she weighed the gold on the small brass scale she used for nothing grander than measuring thread by the ounce, and found it came to more than a week of tokens, for a mend that had taken her an hour. She sat with that fact a long while. It was not, she understood, generosity exactly. Or not only that, it was a man choosing, in front of a witness who mattered, to treat her the way the company's own money said she should be treated and never was, as a person owed a fair wage for a fair piece of work, weighed the same as anyone's. Purdy had said nothing at the time, but she had seen his jaw work, had seen him note the exchange the way he noted everything that touched his counter's monopoly, filing it somewhere behind his eyes for later use. She did not think Reese had done it to make a point. She thought, turning the gold over in the candlelight, that he had simply done the arithmetic the way she did, plainly, without letting the camp's habits enter into the sum, and that this, more than the gold itself, was the thing she could not stop turning over. He came back within the fortnight with a shirt cuff torn at the button, and again a month after that with a blanket seam split along its whole length, and each time the pattern held exactly as it had the first. Wool set down, thanks given in the fewest words that would carry it, gold tipped into her palm instead of scrip, and always at the end, "Ma'am," as though the word were a small formality he was determined not to skip. She began, without deciding to, keeping his mends separate in her memory the way she kept the sums separate in her cloth book, not because the amount mattered more than anyone else's, but because the fact of it did. Her English, still spare, still built one careful sentence at a time, grew a little steadier around him than around most. There was less to guess at in a man who said exactly what he meant and no more. "Thursday," she told him once, of a torn sleeve, and he said, "Thursday's fine," and that was the whole conversation, and she found herself thinking about it longer than 4 words should have earned. By the 3rd gold payment the camp had noticed, because camps noticed everything eventually, and what could not be observed directly was supplied by rumor instead. Some of it was unkind in the ordinary way men are unkind about things they do not understand and would rather laugh at than examine. Some of it was simply curious. Reese was not a man anyone had pictured doing anything as visible as this, in front of Purdy's counter, in full daylight, over and over. A track layer named Sully asked him outright one evening at the cook fire why he didn't just settle his tab like everyone else, and Reese, who rarely answered anything he wasn't asked directly, answered this one. "Because her work's worth what it's worth," he said, "same as mine." It was, by his standards, practically a speech. Sully had no reply ready for it, and the fire popped, and the subject moved on the way camp subjects did, but Lan heard the exchange secondhand within a day, the way everything in Blue Canyon eventually reached her, and sat with those 7 words longer than she let herself admit to anyone, including the cloth book. What the camp did not know about Reese, and what he told almost no one, was that he had left 160 acres of Georgia bottomland behind him, the place his family had worked 3 generations before the war took his father and 2 brothers, and left the land itself standing, but stripped, taxed past what the family could pay, and finally sold out from under his mother for debts that were never entirely hers to begin with. He had come west with nothing but a granite chisel's worth of stubbornness and the conviction, half belief and half discipline, that if he saved every dollar the mines and the grade would give him, he could someday buy the land back from whoever held the deed now and put his mother's name on it again. He told no one this. He barely let himself think it in full sentences, the way a man handles a coal too hot to hold long. He simply saved, and said little, and watched the pay table on Saturdays the way a man watches a distance he is trying to close, dollar by dollar, from a place he was no longer entirely certain he wanted to return to. He took to walking past the wash line in the evenings on his way from the tunnel to the cook fire, a route that was not strictly the shortest one available to him, and she took to noticing the hour he generally passed without ever quite admitting to herself that she was noticing it. One evening he stopped altogether, leaned against the post that held her farthest line, and stood in silence long enough that she finally asked him, in the plain sentences she trusted most, whether something needed mending. No, he said. Then, after a pause that seemed to require some effort of him, just tired of my own company tonight. It was the closest he had come to telling her anything true about himself, and she understood it as such, and did not press for more, only nodded and kept folding, and let him stand there in the lantern light a while longer before he touched his hat and went on to the fire. Neither of them named what had passed between them. She wrote nothing about it in the cloth book. Some sums, she was beginning to learn, did not belong in columns. As summer wore toward its center, the store's monopoly tightened rather than loosened, the way such things did when no competitor existed to force it otherwise. Flour crept up a nickel, then another. Thread, which land needed daily and could buy nowhere else, rose twice in a month for reasons Purdy did not offer and no one dared demand. The Chinese crews, paid in tokens good only here, had no recourse but to pay whatever the counter asked or go without, and going without, on a grade where a torn glove could cost a man a hand, was rarely a real choice. Lan watched the resentment build the way she watched weather build over the ridge, visible, gradual, and eventually unavoidable, in the set of jaws at the pay table, in conversations that stopped when Purdy came within earshot, in the growing number of handkerchiefs brought to her wash line each week, their owners hoping her arithmetic might find some error, some overcharge, some thread of unfairness precise enough to pull. Mostly it could not be pulled. The prices were not illegal. They were simply, entirely, in one man's hands, and everyone in camp had begun to feel the particular weight of that. Her work occasionally took her past the powder magazine, a low canvas-roofed shed set apart from the rest of camp by 100 yards of prudent distance, where the blasting crew stored what the grade consumed by the barrel. She had no business inside it, and no wish to have any. Powder made her nervous the way it made anyone sensible nervous. But the foreman's own tent flap had split along its ridge seam, and mending it meant working within sight of the magazine's open door for the better part of an afternoon. It was there, needle moving on its own while her eyes wandered as they often did, that she first noticed something about the sacks, stacked just inside the doorway, a pale, faintly furred bloom along several of the seams, the kind of thing she recognized instantly, and without needing to be told, because it was the exact same bloom that ruined cloth left damp too long in a trunk. She thought little of it in the moment beyond a seamstress's reflexive disapproval of shoddy stitching. She finished the foreman's tent flap, gathered her kit, and did not think of the sacks again for 3 more days. The 3rd day, delivering a mended shirt to a powderman named Riley, she passed close enough to the stacked sacks to see them properly, and what she saw stopped her where she stood. It was not one sack. It was most of them, a whole delivery by the look of the stamp on the burlap, from a supplier she did not recognize, every seam sewn with a thread that had gone soft and gray wherever damp had reached it, the stitching itself pulling loose in places a good sack should have held for years. She had spent enough of her life around thread to know rot when her fingers found it, and her fingers, without her quite permitting them to, found it now on 3 sacks in a row, tugging a seam apart with almost no resistance at all. A rotten seam on a laundry sack meant a spilled basket. A rotten seam on a powder sack, jostled on a wagon bed, or dropped at the mouth of a blast hole meant something she did not let herself finish imagining standing there in the open doorway. She stepped back from the shed slowly, the way you step back from a thing you are not yet ready to have seen. She told no one that first night, turning the problem over the way she turned over every problem, looking for the safest thread to pull. Telling Callahan, the blasting foreman, outright meant explaining how a laundress came to be handling his powder stock, meant questions about why she'd been near the magazine at all, meant, in a camp where her word already counted for less than a white man's guess, the real possibility of being disbelieved, or blamed, or simply ignored until the next blast proved her right the hard way. So she decided, lying awake with the thimble turning between her fingers, that she would fix what she could reach herself, quietly, before she said a single word to anyone. It was not caution exactly. It was the same instinct that had taught her to reconcile a column before she took it to anyone who might doubt her figures, make the thing undeniable first, and worry about being believed second. The following night, once the camp had gone to its fires and its bunks, she carried her sewing kit past the magazine's unguarded flap and began, sack by sack, to re-sew every seam her fingers could find, gone soft with rot. It took 6 nights, worked an hour or two at a time after the camp had quieted, because more than an hour risked a lantern noticed from outside, and a question she had no ready answer for. She learned the magazine's shadows the way she had learned the wash line's wind, which corner the light from her shielded lamp would and would not reach, which board underfoot creaked and which held silent. Her fingers, already toughened by a year of lye and cold water, blistered anew from the coarser burlap thread, and the brass thimble that had been her father's wore a fresh groove into itself from the pressure of pushing a needle through stitching meant to hold under a wagon's full weight. She counted sacks the way she counted everything, in a private tally she kept in her head rather than the cloth book, because this particular column she did not want written down anywhere it might be found before she was ready. Twice she heard footsteps near the shed and went still in the dark, needle motionless until they passed. No one found her. By the 6th night, every rotten seam she could locate had been opened, restitched, and closed again, tighter than the original had ever been. On the 6th morning, she finished the last sack just as the sky over the ridge went from black to the gray that meant the camp would stir within the hour, and she sat back on her heels in the powder shed's cool dark and let herself, for one unguarded minute, feel the full weight of 6 nights' work in her shoulders and her eyes. She had checked every sack twice more than the work required, the way she checked every ledger twice more than a satisfied customer would have asked her to, because a mistake here did not mean a returned coat or an unhappy tab. It meant something she still would not let herself picture whole. The magazine, as far as her hands and eyes could tell her, was sound now. No one in camp knew it, no one had asked her to do it, and no one would think, looking at the sacks stacked exactly as they had been, that anything about them had changed at all. She gathered her kit, slipped out past the flap into the thin morning light, and walked back to her tent, already composing, in her head, the sentence she would need to say to Callahan, and dreading it. She found Callahan 2 days later, not at the magazine but at his own supply table near the tunnel mouth, and she did not bring him an accusation. She brought him a sack. One of the originals, unmended, that she had set aside precisely for this, the seam still gray and soft with rot exactly as she had first found it. She laid it across his table without a word of preamble, the way Reese had once laid a torn coat across her own, and pulled the seam apart with 2 fingers to show him how little resistance it gave. The others were like this, she said, in the plain English she trusted for exactly this kind of moment, when a sentence needed to carry weight and could afford no ambiguity. I mended them, all of them, 6 nights ago. Callahan looked at the sack, then at her, then at the sack again, his face working through something between disbelief and the beginning of alarm. He asked no questions about how she had gotten inside the magazine unwatched, or why. He picked up the rotten sack, turned it over once in his hands, and told her to wait exactly where she stood while he went to check the rest himself. He was gone the better part of an hour, and when he returned, his face had lost whatever skepticism it had started with. He had gone through the whole stock, sack by sack, and found exactly what she had told him. A supplier's bad batch, every seam sound now where it had no business being sound, stitched in a hand small and even enough that a man could have mistaken it, at a glance, for the original manufacture, except that no factory in California sewed with thread that fine, or that carefully matched to the weight of the burlap it closed. "You did this yourself," he said, and it was not quite a question either, the way Reese's first words to her had not quite been a question. 6 nights, she said again, because it was the truest answer she had. Callahan sat down heavily on an overturned crate and looked at her for a long moment the way a man looks at a fact he has to rearrange his whole understanding of a place to fit. "Next week's blast," he said finally, "was going with that batch." He did not finish the sentence any further than that. He did not need to. They both understood exactly what the unfinished half contained. The following week, the crew moved the mended stock up to the grade to charge the new cut through the granite shoulder above the tunnel, and Callahan, without explaining to anyone why, personally inspected every sack that left the magazine before it went onto a wagon, running his own thumb along seams that had already been checked twice by hands more skilled than his. He said nothing to the powdermen about where the mending had come from. Lan watched the wagons go up from a distance, the way she watched most of the camp's important moments, from the edge rather than the center, and found she could not keep her hands entirely steady at the wash line that morning, though the work itself required nothing more of her than it required any other day. Reese worked that crew. She had not let herself think about that fact directly until the wagons were already climbing, and once she had let herself think it, she could not entirely stop. She told herself the sacks were sound. She had tested every seam herself, twice. It did not make the waiting any shorter, or the particular knot in her chest any looser, until the first charge went off at midday and the sound came down the canyon clean and ordinary. The blast went exactly as a blast was meant to go, a flat, enormous cough, a fan of gray dust and shattered granite lifting off the shoulder of the grade, and then, within the minute, the powdermen moving back in through the settling haze to assess the cut, the way they did after every charge that behaved itself. Nothing tore loose early, nothing jostled or spilled or failed on the wagon ride or in the drilled hole or in the charging itself. By the time the dust had cleared enough to see the new gap opened clean through the shoulder of rock, the crew had already moved on to clearing debris, the whole event already receding into the ordinary rhythm of a grade that blasted rock most days of the working season. Nobody but Callahan, and nobody but Lan, understood that this particular ordinary afternoon had very nearly not been ordinary at all. She heard the charge from the wash line, felt the familiar pressure against her sternum, and let out a breath she had been holding, without quite noticing she was holding it, since the wagons had climbed out of sight that morning. The camp went back to its business. She went back to hers. Neither of them said anything to anyone. Reese heard it from Callahan himself, 3 evenings later, over a shared pipe near the tunnel mouth the foreman had chosen deliberately for its distance from other ears. Callahan told it plainly, the way he told most things, the rotten batch, the 6 nights, the sack laid across his table without a word of blame in it, and Reese listened without interrupting, the way he listened to most things, though something in his stillness had gone a degree quieter than its usual quiet by the time Callahan finished. "She never told anyone," Callahan said, half to himself, watching the smoke. "Could have let it ride, and no one the wiser till it wasn't." Reese said nothing for a while. He was thinking, though he would not have said so to Callahan or to anyone, of a cloth ledger he had once glimpsed the edge of, folded shut, when he'd brought her a torn sleeve, and of how little he had understood at the time about what a woman might be keeping in a book that size. He had thought he was paying her fairly for good work. He understood now, sitting with the pipe going cold in his hand, that he had not yet begun to guess the size of what she carried. Callahan had not meant to tell anyone else, and Reese certainly had not, but a camp of 200 men kept few secrets longer than a week, and this one traveled the way the best ones did, quietly, mouth to mouth, gaining small details at each stop that were not quite accurate, and not quite false either, until by the following Saturday, most of the grade knew some version of the story. That the laundress had found the powder gone bad, that she'd fixed it herself in secret, that the blast that should have taken half the crew with it had gone off clean because of her. Some of it was exaggerated. The essential shape of it was not. Men who had never once addressed her directly began nodding to her at the wash line, an acknowledgement so small she might have missed it if she had not been watching for exactly this kind of shift her whole life, in a father's guild hall where a woman's competence was permitted to exist only if it stayed invisible. It was not invisible anymore, she was not certain, turning the new attention over the way she turned over any unfamiliar sum, whether that made her safer in this camp, or simply more exposed within it. Purdy heard the story too, and heard it, correctly, as a story in which the company store's own supplier had nearly killed half the grade through negligence nobody had caught, nobody but a laundress with no standing to have caught it at all, which made the whole thing worse rather than better in whatever ledger Purdy kept of his own dignity. He said nothing about it directly. What he did the following Monday was stand in the store's doorway when the morning line of Chinese crewmen came down off the grade for oil and thread, and tell them, without apology or explanation beyond the bare fact of it, that he wasn't serving Chinese customers that day. He served the white crews who arrived an hour later without comment, as though the morning's line had never happened. It was not illegal. It required no ledger entry and left no evidence beyond 40 men's memory of standing at a locked door with their tokens useless in their pockets. Lan heard about it before noon, the details already sharpening the way rumor sharpened in this camp, and understood immediately, with the particular clarity that came from having spent a year doing the sums, exactly what kind of arithmetic Purdy had just performed, and against whom. There was no ledger anywhere in camp for what Purdy had done, no figure Lan could write in her cloth book and carry to anyone with authority to overrule it, because the store was his to run as he chose, and the company had never once suggested otherwise. The men turned away that morning needed oil for their lamps, thread for their own mending, tobacco some of them had gone without pay to afford, a few had walked the whole way down from the grade for exactly those goods, and walked back up with empty hands, and a fresh, specific humiliation added to a year of smaller ones. Ah Kwok, who had first brought her his handkerchief of tokens back in spring, found her at the wash line that evening and said little, only that he did not know what a man was meant to do with tokens that bought nothing anywhere. She did not have an answer ready. She had spent a year proving, patiently, in careful columns, exactly what the company owed each man who asked her. And proof, she was beginning to understand with a bitterness she rarely let herself feel in full, had never once been the thing standing between Purdy and his locked door. Reese was coming off shift when he passed the store, and saw the last of the turned-away men walking back up toward the grade with nothing in their hands, and he stood a moment at the edge of the path working out. In the slow, deliberate way he worked out everything, exactly what he had just watched happen. He thought of the 6 nights nobody had asked her to spend, re-sewing rotten seams by lantern light so 100 men could keep their arms and legs. He thought of a locked door standing between those same men and a spool of thread. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him by how little doubt it carried, that he had spent the whole summer paying one woman fairly for her own work, while the rest of the camp's arithmetic stayed exactly as broken as it had always been, and that fair treatment offered quietly, one transaction at a time, was not going to be enough to move a door that size. He did not go to the cook fire that evening. He sat outside his own tent a long while, turning his gold poke over in his hands, doing a sum of his own that had nothing to do with land in Georgia. He came for her the following Saturday, at the pay table, in front of the whole camp assembled for its usual ritual of coin to one line and brass to the other, and asked her, in a voice pitched to carry further than his usual, whether she still had her tokens from the year. All of them, every Saturday's worth, kept somewhere he assumed a woman who kept a ledger this careful would have kept. She did. She had never spent a token she did not have to, converting what she could into coin equivalents for May's passage and keeping the rest. Out of a habit she had never examined closely, exactly where she could find it. She fetched the tin. By the time she returned, word had already moved through camp the way it always did, and a crowd had gathered near the assayer's shed at the edge of the grade. drawn by nothing more than the sight of Reese standing in front of it, with his hat off, and an expression the camp had rarely, if ever, seen on him. He took the tin from her hands, walked it to the small brass scale the assayer used to weigh ore samples, and set it down on the pan without a word of explanation to anyone watching. "Bring your book," he said to her, the first thing he had said since asking for the tin, and she understood, with a jolt that ran the length of her spine, exactly what he intended. She fetched the cloth ledger from beneath her cot and returned to find the crowd doubled, Purdy among them now, standing at the edge with his arms crossed and his face gone the particular gray of a man watching a reckoning arrive that he cannot stop. Reese opened her ledger himself, asked her to read the figures aloud rather than trusting his own unfamiliar eye on characters he could not follow, and she read, "Saturday by Saturday, a year of tokens converted to their coin equivalent, the true value against the brass she had actually received, the gap between the two growing wider some weeks and narrower others but never once, in 52 Saturdays, closing entirely." For each figure she read, he weighed gold from his own poke onto the assayer's scale against the coin value she named, and set it aside in a small growing pile on the crate beside her ledger, until the whole year sat there in dust and small nuggets, weighed out publicly, coin by coin, against a book no one in camp but her had ever been trusted to read before that morning. When the last figure had been read and weighed, he set the whole pile, a full year's difference between what the company had promised in tokens and what it had actually delivered, into her hands, and told her, in the same plain voice he had used for every sentence of the last quarter hour, that it was owed to her and he was glad to be the one settling it, since no one else in this camp had shown any intention of doing so. The crowd, which had gone nearly silent through the reading and the weighing, stayed silent a moment longer after he finished, long enough that the only sound was the assayer's scale settling back to rest on its empty pan. Then someone, she never learned who, afterward, and never asked, began, very quietly, to clap, and the sound spread through the gathered men the way the story of the powder sacks had spread weeks before, mouth to mouth, hand to hand, until it was no longer a private reckoning between one miner and one laundress, but something the whole grade had witnessed and could not unwitness. Purdy, at the crowd's edge, said nothing at all. He did not need to. His face had already said everything the moment required. What happened next was not organized by anyone, least of all by Lan, who had never once asked the camp to do anything on her behalf, and would not have known how to ask if she had wanted to. It simply began, the following Monday, when the usual morning line at the store's counter failed to form. The Chinese crews, to a man, carried their tokens up to the grade instead, and made do with what they already had, mended what could be mended, borrowed what could be borrowed, went without what could be gone without, rather than spend another token across that particular counter. By Wednesday, several of the white crews had joined them, less out of solidarity spoken aloud than out of a shared, wordless sense that a door locked against 40 men over nothing was a door none of them wished to walk through either. Purdy stood behind an empty counter for 4 straight days, watching goods he had ordered at cost sit unbought on his own shelves, and understood, the way any storekeeper eventually understood an emptied room, that something in the camp's accounting had shifted in a direction his prices could no longer control. By the second week, the pressure had traveled further than Purdy's own counter. The company's regional office, which cared little for fairness but cared a great deal for a supply store returning no revenue on a grade that still needed to be fed, sent a man up the line to ask Purdy directly why receipts had fallen by more than half in a fortnight, and Purdy, who had no honest answer that did not implicate his own doorway the previous Monday, gave an evasive one that satisfied no one, least of all the company man doing the asking. Word of that visit reached the camp within a day, the way everything reached the camp within a day now that its channels of rumor had been so thoroughly exercised all summer. Lan heard it from Ah Kwok, who heard it from a teamster, who had heard it from someone in the company office itself, and she wrote nothing about it in the cloth book, because for the first time in a year, the figures she cared about were not hers to calculate. They belonged, for once, to men who had never once bothered to ask what her arithmetic cost her to keep. The notice went up on the post beside the pay table on a Thursday, In English, Lan could read now with only occasional difficulty, and in a Chinese translation someone had thought, for once, to provide beside it, effective the coming Saturday, all camp personnel would be paid in coin, without distinction of crew or shift. No reason was given, no apology was offered, and none, Lan understood, ever would be. Companies did not apologize, they simply adjusted the figures until the losses stopped, and the adjustment itself was the only acknowledgement a year of buttons was ever going to receive. Still, she stood in front of that notice longer than the reading required, running her thumb along the paper the way she ran it along a seam to test its strength, and found the words held. Around her, men gathered to read it a second and third time as though the meaning might change on inspection, and the mood along the pay table that afternoon was unlike anything she had felt there in a year. Not triumph exactly, nothing so simple as that, but something closer to a held breath finally permitted to let go. That Saturday the pay table carried only one kind of box, and inside it, for the first time since she had arrived in Blue Canyon, sealed envelopes of coin waited for every name on Dolan's ledger without exception. When her turn came, Dolan looked up. Not out of any change of heart she could fully credit him with, she suspected, so much as the plain fact that there was no longer a second, faster line to hurry toward, and asked her, for the first time in a year, how her name should be written on the envelope. She told him, watched him form the English letters in his careful clerk's hand, LAN, and then, before he could seal it, asked to borrow his pen for one line more. Beside the English letters, she wrote her own name in the characters her father had taught her before he taught her anything else, small and exact, the ink still wet when Dolan finally sealed the envelope and handed it across the table into her open palm. Coin this time, the weight of it entirely different from a year of brass, though it was, she thought, turning the envelope over once, not really the weight that had changed. In the weeks that followed, men kept coming to her wash line, but the reasons had shifted. They still brought torn coats and split blankets, but increasingly they brought questions too, a disputed sum on a coin envelope, a debt between two crews that needed an impartial hand to settle it, a figure from the company office that seemed wrong and needed checking against someone's trusted arithmetic before anyone dared raise it. She had spent a year being paid in tokens the company set the value of. She found herself now, without ever applying for the position, the closest thing the camp had to an office of record. Her cloth book consulted the way men once might have consulted a company ledger, except that her figures, unlike the company's, had never once been wrong when checked. Even Callahan brought her a disputed powder order to reconcile, in October, with no trace of irony in the request. She kept the book the same way she always had, careful columns by candlelight, thimble worn smoother every month. What had changed was not her arithmetic. It was who, finally, believed it belonged to someone worth trusting. It was Reese, on an evening in late October with the first real cold coming down off the ridge, who finally told her what the saved gold in his poke had always been for, the Georgia land. His mother's name once on the deed, 3 generations of a family's work he had meant, since the war ended, to buy back $1 at a time. He told it plainly, the way he told everything, and then admitted, in a voice that cost him more than the story itself had, that he was no longer certain, sitting here, that he wanted the thing he had spent 5 years saving toward. Lan listened without interrupting, and when he finished she told him, in return, about a sister named May in Toishan, 12 years old, growing up in a house with one less earner than it needed, and a passage that half of every dollar Lan made was quietly buying toward, coin by coin, the same patient way he had once bought toward a Georgia field. Neither of them offered the other advice. They sat with both accounts laid open between them instead, the way 2 ledgers might sit side by side, close enough to compare, not yet asked to be reconciled into one. By the first hard frost, Reese had stopped adding to the Georgia sum entirely, a fact he mentioned to no one, and that Lan noticed only because she had, without either of them naming it, begun keeping a private column for his gold, the same careless, attentive way she kept every column that mattered to her. What he did instead, the second week of November, was walk down to the lumber yard the company had opened for men building past the canvas stage of camp life, and order boards, enough for a single room with a proper stove, a door that shut against the wind coming down off the grade, 2 windows facing east toward whatever the mornings in Blue Canyon chose to bring. He told the yardman it was for 2. He did not explain further, and the yardman, who had heard the story of the assayer's scale like everyone else on the grade, did not ask him to. That evening, Lan found the lumber stacked at the edge of a cleared plot near the wash line, still smelling of raw pine, and understood before he ever said a single word what a man who counted so carefully and so rarely had finally decided was worth the whole of his saved gold.